when you talk about church, it has a very dated appeal. People think it's hymn books, organs, sit on your hands, keep very, very quiet. When you sneeze, somebody says, bless you. But that's not really what the church is like in today. The church is full of life. It's full of ordinary people, just like you and like me. But based on your impressions of what church is, if somebody was to come up to you and say to you, tell me about the gospel, where would you start the story? Would you start it in Bethlehem at the manger, with the misty-eyed shepherds listening to angel songs? Or would you start it at the wedding in Cana, when Jesus did his first miracle, turning water into wine? Or would you start even earlier with the prophecies of Isaiah, like we do during Advent? Where would you start the story of the gospel? For the disciples of Jesus, those who had just been through a roller coaster of events over the last several weeks, the story began on the walk home from the tomb. After the exhausting events of the return to Jerusalem, their last supper together, the betrayals and failures among their group, the paralysing fear and horror as they watched their friend be tortured and killed, then the utter confusion of running to the tomb where they buried him, only to find it empty. With all these experiences, it's hardly likely that their minds would be spinning in confusion. And probably a little bit like the confusion that we have today when we try to think an empty tomb, Jesus risen from the dead. That sort of confusion would probably have been going through their minds. They didn't know where Jesus was exactly, or where he would come back. And if he did, what their relationship would be like. But they did know one thing. That morning had dawned, the tomb was empty, and horror of horrors, life kept going on. It was on the walk home that they surely faced the stunning reality that the world was still turning. Life was being lived, and somehow they had to make sense of it. Just like us today. Life goes on. We have to make sense of it. What is the journey we're on? Where are we going? How are we going to get there? Who are we going to journey with? The tomb was empty and Mary had seen Jesus. But as they walked home from the tomb that morning, those who had followed Jesus so closely must have been asking the questions. What now? Where do we go from here? What does the gospel message Jesus came to teach us mean in practical terms for my life? Anything? The story of the gospel of Jesus Christ becoming reality in the lives of his followers, in the lives of all humanity, who would come to engage in relationship with the risen Christ, began then, on the way home from the tomb, when exhausted, grief-stricken followers of Jesus had to find some way to articulate the experience that had changed their lives. Remember, Peter was the disciple Jesus called the rock, the one of whom the church would be built. Surely Peter didn't know what that meant when Jesus said to it. And my guess is that building a church was the last thing on his mind. He denied he even knew Jesus. And yet Jesus said, "You will be my rock." But here in the second chapter of Acts, not even 2 months after that day, they ran to find an empty tomb, preaching in public with authority and conviction, telling his own story of faith in such a way that people around him recognized their own encounters with the gospel way of living, and wanted to join Peter in forming attempts to articulate what the gospel of Jesus Christ could possibly mean for someone like him. His testimony ignited the passion of all those around him who were also craving an authentic encounter with God. I want want to bear that in mind, his passion. It's Peter we're talking about, the guy who previously denied Jesus, and yet he's here speaking with passion about his testimony. And Peter didn't have a very impressive pedigree. He was an uneducated fisherman who struggled publicly with his own commitment to Christ. Certainly not someone in high demand as a public speaker. He didn't have any of the things we've come to associate with a person who ignites others with a compelling message and starts a religious movement that changes the world. But somehow he managed it. What he did have was a story. And it was his story. He owned it. It was what happened in his life, what happened with his encounters with Jesus. It was his and his story to tell. And because of his encounter with the living Christ, there was no way that he could keep silent. The story of his own transformation, of the conviction he had with the gospel message, could change the world. These kept bubbling up from inside him, and there was no way he could keep the story to himself any longer. How does the gospel message matter in your life, in my life? How does the gospel message matter right here in St. Stephen's Church? How do we practice resurrection? How do we practice sharing those wonderful words that Jesus is alive? One way we do this is testimony. An onerous, baggage-laden term for just what Peter was doing that day in the crowd, sharing his own story about how knowing Jesus had changed his life. And you and I have stories like that to share. When we share them with each other, we're practicing resurrection. We are living like Easter really matters after all. It's not just about Easter eggs and how many Easter eggs you can get and how many Easter eggs you can eat and how many times you can be sick. The Easter message is very, very important to our state of well-being. Jesus came to save. Jesus rose from the dead and is alive in us today. That's the Easter message. Just like many of you suspected, testimony is a long-standing tradition in Christian practice. The version of the practice was probably most familiar with those who come from the Puritans, who used testimony as a rite of passage. Your testimony was a story of stepping into your predefined role, an experience of finally submitting to the rigorous expectations God had for your life. The story of giving in to God. The kind of testimony leaves everything nice and neat in its conclusion. I once was lost, but now I'm found. I was blind, but now I see. Everything nice and neat, little boxes. There's nothing wrong with that kind of testimony. But its practice has had an end result of inadvertently creating environments where when you hear a testimony like this one and your experience isn't the same, it's not nice and neat and in conformity with everyone else's, well then you're likely to think that your story or experience of God is somehow inauthentic and not quite genuine. So what is the kind of testimony that births new life? Lives like yours and mine and in churches like ours, you already know because you do it all the time. A true testimony is the kind of story that helps us to practice resurrection as individuals and as a community. It's not a story about God fixing us. It's not a story about God fixing us. But really an individual and totally unique story of resurrection of God's continued work in our lives. In your life, in my life. To create something beautiful out of brokenness and pain. that's what God does. He works with us where we are. We don't have to achieve a certain point in life before we can access God's love. He's with us now. He's with us in our brokenness. He's with us in our pain. Everyone's a little bit different. And everyone in its telling is an exercise in living like Easter matters. Your story isn't the same as my story. Fran's story is not the same as Dave's story. Pat's story is not the same as Kevin's story. They're all individual stories, and they're all your stories to share, and they are unique to you. And how God works in your life is shared out through those stories, and those stories then become testimonies to the way that Jesus is working in the world today. When I was little, I learned a rhyme, and I'm sure many of you know it with the actions, but I've forgotten the actions. And it went something like this. He is the church. He is the steeple. Keep going. Open the doors, and he is the people. He is the church. He is the steeple. Open the doors, and he is all the people. And when we walk about practicing resurrection, we're not talking about the church as a building or a steeple. We certainly have a nice church here. But when we talk church, we're not talking about the building. Buildings, churches, they shrivel and die, just like the experts say. What we're actually talking about are those of us inside the buildings reaching out to the world and sharing our testimonies, our stories of gospel living. Why is it that we even look for God, and how it is that God finds us over and over again? So if you were telling your story of the gospel of Jesus Christ becoming a reality for your life and for mine, where would you start your story? If we're serious about practicing resurrection, then we should know the story starts again in your life and in my life right now. So go tell it. Share your story with the person next to you. When you're at work, share your story. When you're at home, share your story. Share your stories within your own families of just what God's doing in your lives.